How about now? Can you hear me now? Excellent. Welcome, everyone. My name is Cristina Rombaitis Del Rio. I'm a senior advisor on adaptation and resilience with the UN Foundation, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session on adaptation without borders, knowledge sharing, and international cooperation to manage transboundary climate risks. This session is being live streamed, so welcome to all of those joining online. And we ask that those in the audience use your headphones to hear. You'll hear better that way because there's a lot of ambient noise here. And do put your hand up if you're having any technical difficulties. We have people who will come and sort those out for you. We have an incredibly rich panel prepared for you today, and so we'll get straight into it. But maybe just a few words before we hear from our first speaker about transboundary climate risks. These are risks of many different kinds. It includes the risks shared between countries, which can be shared ecosystems or infrastructure that crosses borders, or shared ocean issues. But they can also span across countries and across oceans and affect things like trade and energy supplies. And the impact can be increasing inequity, increasing poverty, forced migration, conflict. And so we want to dig into understanding these risks, and more importantly, what can we do about them? How can international cooperation, how can better knowledge sharing help address these risks? So we're going to hear from a number of high-level experts from different regions and from different walks of life and practice to talk about the materiality of these risks and how we can build a more resilient society by addressing these risks head-on. Our first speaker is Jessica Troney, who is the head of climate change, the Climate Change Adaptation Unit for the UN Environment Program. Jessica, please come up on stage, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate, and thank you for the audience for making the time to come. My name is Jessica Troney. I head the Adaptation Unit at UNEP, based in Nairobi. So I'm just going to give you an example of transboundary risks in the African region, and two project examples that we're implementing, and hopefully give you maybe ideas or trigger questions. So let's get to it. Okay, so the objectives of this event are to raise awareness of transboundary climate change impacts and risks, identify examples of such risks and recommendations for integrating them into policies, showcase successful examples of regional cooperation, and facilitate a discussion between us all on the issue of transboundary risks. The outcomes of this side event are going to contribute to a policy brief that we are preparing in partnership with the Stockholm Environment Institute on the materiality of transboundary risks as well as adaptation strategies to address them. So we're really hoping to get your feedback so that we can integrate that into the policy brief. So I'm going to be talking about the Lake Victoria Basin. It's the largest water body shared by in Africa, shared by Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, supporting the largest inland fishery, supporting 40 million people. In 2019 to 2020, there was unprecedented lake water levels, resulting in massive flooding in adjacent areas and downstream. Water volume hit record high again in 2024, so just 4 years later. High water levels are linked with climate change, but as well with environmental degradation and urbanization around the lake, contributing to increased runoff and sedimentation. So that's an important point, because developmental processes produce the vulnerability with climate change. And so understanding where those factors are of vulnerability gives us the solution space for adaptation. Then when we look at South Sudan, the increased Lake Victoria water height contributed to floods through the White Nile reaching South Sudan. Right now, in the ongoing floods, over 1 million people are estimated to have been affected, with 375,000 people displaced. So this is really interesting because it shows the ecological connection, the dynamic linking Lake Victoria with a non-riparian country such as South Sudan. Extensive damage to homes, crops and infrastructure have been observed, disruptions to education and health services and an increased risk of disease outbreaks, as well as links to conflicts. So what we're seeing really is a breakdown of the social economic system in South Sudan as we speak, with climate change as the trigger to that. So there's an area of land between South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda and Kenya called the Karamoja Cluster. It's a cross-border area inhabited by pastoralist and agro-pastoralist communities with common historical, social and cultural ancestry and language. You get that a lot in Africa, by the way. The communities have a long history for developing strategies to optimize livestock production. Seasonal pastoralist mobility is used as a strategy for managing the rangeland, moving with livestock across wide territories within and across national borders. The impacts of climate change affect rangeland productivity, water availability, exacerbating competition for resources, and increasing potential for conflict. The result is forced displacement and migration, primarily caused by conflict and weather-related events. So there's a deep correlation between conflict, food security, climate change, displacement, and migration. So I'm going to present to you two projects that we're doing, one in South Sudan and one in the Lake Victoria Basin region. They're not connected, they're separate projects. So this one is funded by the Least Developed Countries Fund. It was started in 2019, I believe, 2020. COVID hit, so it didn't really advance very far, but we're now fully into the implementation phase. In terms of pastoralists, about 75% of households in South Sudan own livestock. There are more livestock than people. It's the 6th largest livestock herd in Africa. Climate change exacerbates existing stresses in South Sudan, including uncertainty around livestock health and the livelihoods of the pastoralist communities. And this is typically due to the loss of pasture lands and access to water resources. So what the project is doing for this, there we go. So there are a few components. It's an integrated strategy, but in terms of pastoralists, the key intervention is water supply harvesting infrastructure in 2 states, Terekek and Capoeira. They're called Hafiz. They're massive, well, they're small scale, but they're still quite large water harvesting structures. And that's really to alleviate frequent tensions between pastoralists and to help the livestock survive. And there's an early warning component in this project, both helping agro-pastoralists, so a large proportion of this community also grow crops. Okay, then to the Lake Victoria Basin project. It's located, this project, in 5 countries, Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania and Uganda. And it has 5, it's actually finished now. We conducted the terminal evaluation this year, but it had 5 components: regional management of transboundary water catchment, climate information dissemination, regional approach to adaptation in vulnerable communities, community-based approaches and knowledge management. I have to say that the most successful part of this project was the community-based adaptation. We had small grants programs working in 5 countries. The component that was the most challenging was the regional cooperation. And so we need to do a little bit more thinking about how to promote dialogue and action around regional approaches. So, as I said, we had small grants programs in 5 countries, supported a range of technologies and practices, from water harvesting to boreholes to small dams, small-scale dams, fish drying kilns, other small enterprises, land restoration, and it really did have a fantastic impact. And what we saw, when you talk about transformational impact, what we saw is that some of these pilots just transformed the communities themselves, transformed them into enterprises and knock-on supply chains. So, for example, with the fish drying kilns, some enterprising individuals, formed mobile units that took the technology around to villages. So pretty amazing to see that. And so lessons learned for this project. By the way, you can find the terminal evaluation on the UNEP website. But here are some of the main lessons learned. Climate change adaptation works best when it's driven by communities at the lowest level, implemented by community groups. Capacity building and learning exchange between peer groups is really powerful in transforming mindsets, but it does take time. And here I'm also thinking about the transformational adaptation, the dialogues around that, because there seems to be an idea that transformation happens quickly at a very large scale, but this project shows that it's often a slow process and it happens at the lowest level. Successful implementation of the small-scale sub-projects has demonstrated the viability of locally led approaches. It's important to allocate sufficient time to allow the uptake of proposed technologies and demonstration of the full scope of benefits to communities and ecosystems. And gender considerations are absolutely critical in addressing structural inequalities. So I hope that that was interesting and informative. And just to say, although this is a side event about transboundary adaptation, the solutions are often going to be at the local level. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'll take that as well. Thank you. I think that provides an introduction to the issue and really highlighted examples that are very current and actually very big, but also that the solutions can be small and transformative even at a community level. Just to put things in a little bit in context for the negotiations, and Jessica, you touched on the transformation issue. The agreement out of COP28 last year, the global stocktake, really highlighted the issue of transboundary climate risks. In the global stocktake decision, parties recognize that climate change impacts are often transboundary in nature and may involve complex cascading risks that require knowledge sharing and international cooperation for addressing them. And similarly, the global goal on adaptation and the decision around the UAE framework for global climate resilience also emphasize that climate risks can benefit from climate change impacts are often transboundary in nature and may involve complex cascading risks that benefit from knowledge sharing and international cooperation. And we've seen that issue even come up in the negotiations just in the past few days. So this is also a very real and very current subject. I'd love to invite our panelists up on stage, if you wouldn't mind coming up. We're going to have a bit of a conversation now to kind of unpack these risks a little bit further. Our first speaker is Tahir Gozel, and I guess I can have a seat as well. Good. Our first speaker, we're pleased to have Tahir Gozel here. He is an entrepreneur and investor and founder of the Tahir Gozel Initiative for Development in Azerbaijan. So welcome, we're delighted to have you here and to hear about the region where we currently sit, but also have a private sector perspective on the panel. First question for you is, how do you see climate risks affecting things like trade and supply chains in this region? And how does this then in turn affect the private sector from what you've seen?
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here in this extraordinary booth of ODI. I'm a businessman. I am in agriculture and as well as dry cargo and wet cargo transportation. It really is extraordinary, the significance of climate change in this region. It is very, very alarming. The first thing, obviously, is water stress. Azerbaijan is suffering deeply from this now. And it is not that there's not enough rain. There is. Probably the average volume of rain is the same. It's spread much. So you have periods of floods and drought here. And you have heat stress in the summer. The farmers which are collecting their produce in the summer, a lot of them gets spoiled. Then there is the issue with pests as the temperatures rise. Pest control becomes a great, great issue here. And when you grow bigger and you go out of the supply side to transportation, the Caspian Sea, which is a very, very important sea that regulates the flow of cargo all the way from China to Europe, the levels are coming drastically down. We see storms, delays in transportation, even in the Black Sea. We see that the weather patterns cause a lot of demurrage claims to the transshippers. A lot of it's affected. Also, I am also active in agriculture in Uzbekistan, and the situation there is exactly the same. And one of the greatest problem I see is that when you have things like water stress, the bigger companies, multinationals, companies like us, are much better prepared. The real people who suffer are the small farmers. And the whole point of agriculture is the subsistence for the normal poor people that needs this to survive, because they're not prepared, because they can't produce tanks. They don't have pivot irrigation systems to save on water. That is very, very alarming. It really is. In the Fergana Valley, the same thing. Of 14,000 glaciers in Tajikistan, which is the source of water for the Fergana Valley, the most fertile valley in that region, 1,000 are already full dry. 16% of the glaciers in Kyrgyzstan, the second source of water for that whole region, is already disappeared. It really is very, very alarming.
Thank you. That's indeed extremely alarming and interesting to see then the whole chain of effects that cascade from the farmer fields, from the glacier melt to the farmer field to the shipping and trade. I'd love to see where you see the opportunities for private sector companies to be managing these climate risks more proactively. What do you need? What do you see as the entry points to be able to make a positive difference?
I think the first thing we need is for the governments to understand that this is a transboundary project. Ecology is something you can't say a single government can handle this. The first thing we as private entity needs is, first of all, to be active, working side along with the government, working with think tanks, with NGOs, support them, and be an active advocate that we have to go transboundary. And that is why I think even institutions like ODI can play a very, very important role in spearheading the formation of these transboundary discussions. So I'm really proud of this panel that we're doing. As private entity, well, we can do a lot of investments. We can call for increasing finance. What have I done? What have I done as an individual? Well, I have rented my whole transportation fleet, 0 kilometers, brand new cars, because around 60% of the Azerbaijan transportation fleet are 15 years and older, the trucks. And they are heavy emitters of carbon. And also the government of Azerbaijan is also, all the governments should actively go for alternative current transportation locomotives for the cargo to pass through. We need to create ships that transport cargo over the Caspian Sea with inert gas system to save a lot of, again, CO2. So there's a lot of role the private sector can do, but I think the best is that if we do it in cooperation with think tanks, with NGOs, and with the governments.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think you really highlighted the points of partnership and again, the holistic picture. All the pieces need to be there. We're going to move on to Katie Harris next. Katie Harris is the Director of Adaptation Without Borders. And by the way, I am saving time for Q&A with the audience, just so everybody knows there will be an opportunity for that. Katie, I know you're standing in for a panelist that was going to be with us, but you're going to take us back to Africa to tell us a little bit about partnerships there to manage transboundary risks within policy spheres. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Yeah, it will have not escaped your notice that I am not David Awalala from the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Group, and he sends his deepest apologies that he can't be here. He was called into some urgent discussions with African parliamentarians on this topic at the last moment. But we have been working within Adaptation Without Borders with stakeholders from right across the African continent over the last couple of years. So I thought I'd just give you a flavor, a highlight of what we've been doing. So the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Group, or AGNES, are a group that are really set up to support the African Group of Negotiators and other stakeholders across Africa to translate some of the science that we know in terms of is impacting the climate risks that are impacting Africa, and translate that into the sorts of decisions, the sorts of policies that we need to see on adaptation. And over the past 2 years, we have been working together with the African Union Commission, with the African Union Development Agency, or AUDA-NAPAD, with the Least Developed Country Group, and of course also with the AGN, and with a range of regional economic communities across Africa, alongside civil society, to discuss the transboundary climate risks that the continent faces and how we can strengthen adaptation to them. We've been looking at all different types of transboundary climate risk. So we've been looking not only at those that face neighbouring countries within the continents that we heard about from Jessica earlier, those that proliferate through shared ecosystems, through shared river basins and so on. But we've also been looking at how African countries right across the continent are vulnerable to climate change impacts happening from all around the world. And that's because risks are generated because of the food they import or the medicines they support, the pharmaceutical supply chains that they're reliant upon, where you've got big manufacturing hubs and critical raw materials are subject to climate risks. These all create a number of risks to supply chains, to trade and industry. And we've also been looking at remittances from around the world and how they could be impacted by climate risks, foreign direct investments that African countries make, and so on. So it's not just these risks that proliferate through ecosystems, it's also through trade, foreign policy, relationships, geopolitics, finance, and so on. So interesting to note that the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan, which runs from 2022 to 2032, actually is quite a front runner in recognizing the need to enhance coordination between the regional economic communities and the African Union's member states in addressing and managing transboundary and cascading climate risks. And in 2023, we saw ministers at the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, so AMCEN, take a collective decision to encourage their member states to cooperate in the development of regional climate risk assessments, frameworks, plans, programs, and indicators on resilience building to transboundary and cascading climate risks, showing that it really has high-level political support. We've been working with a number of other partners within Adaptation Without Borders to produce some really key policy-driven research outputs. So we've been exploring the policy mechanisms of the African Union and the RECs, the Regional Economic Communities, to manage transboundary climate risks. So really looking into what existing governance frameworks there are out there. We've been developing guidance on integrating and managing transboundary climate risks in adaptation and sectoral planning. We've been producing policy briefs and also taking stock of what knowledge is out there on the specific transboundary climate risks the region faces. Just one more moment, if I may, Christina. So this all came together at a 2023 policy dialogue that we hosted in Nepal, where we really had discussions with the regional economic communities and governments, as well as the international community, on whose job it is to manage these risks. And this led to us co-producing a roadmap for African resilience. So what are the steps that we need to take in order to build resilience to transboundary climate risks by 2032? That roadmap now exists. It just needs some funding to put it into action. This year we're continuing the work. We're working in Senegal to look at how a particular country, so in West Africa, is exposed and vulnerable to transboundary climate risks. And we're working with the LDC group and the AGN to develop some indicators on transboundary climate risks to feed into the UAE to Belém work programme. So just on the final note, I would say, we really see a strong push. It's really encouraging a push from a whole range of African stakeholders who are really recognizing the importance of transboundary climate risks, particularly for countries that are doubly hit, if you like, by both the direct impacts of climate change and the transboundary impacts of climate change. But, and I think this will be a critical discussion here, we need the adaptation financing community to catch up. At the moment, we're really lacking this sufficient finance we need to adapt to transboundary climate risks. And if you'd like to read more on that, a colleague of mine wrote a brief where she analysed how much multilateral climate finance was going to support transboundary projects. And barring the Adaptation Fund, it's a pretty dismal picture. So happy to talk more about that, but I'll pass the floor on to others in a moment.
Thank you so much, Katie. And for highlighting the issue of finance, which definitely we'll want to come back to, and of course the Adaptation Fund massively received massive did not meet its target by a massive amount. That's what I'm trying to say, unfortunately, in the first week of COP. We're going to move through all of the panelists, and then we will have time for a bit more of discussion and questions. Our next speaker takes us over to Latin America. We have Dr. Maria del Pilar Bueno Rubial, who is a senior researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council of Argentina, or CONICET, and a professor at the Universidad Nacional de Rosario in Argentina. Pilar, so good to have you here. I would love to hear from your perspective, what are the opportunity to strengthen the mandates and capabilities at national, regional, and global institutions to better support knowledge sharing and international cooperation on transboundary risks, particularly in the Latin America and Caribbean region?
Thank you very much, Christina, for the question, and also thank you for having me and for inviting me, as always, to talk about transboundary climate risks. Is my pleasure, and also to give a voice to my region, to Latin America and the Caribbean today. That's also important for me to reflect. So I will keep my intervention to two main areas, let's say. First, the global one, and I'm happy I came after Katie because she touched three things I would like to really pick up and continue a little bit. The first one with respect to, main context we have here in COP29, including the GGI conversations and, of course, NCQG conversation. So more global level and more global discussions with respect to transboundary climate risk, along with with Katie and all the team many times. I think the question after this very good outcome that is there in the sessions last year is what is next. So, of course, the Global Goal on Adaptation and the UAE framework is one piece of that. But at the same time, we need to know how to reflect that in a better way. So there are many questions, and we heard during this first week many different groups and countries saying they really would like to see transboundary climate risks reflected on additional guidance to the experts and modalities. So we have a good challenge there to understand during this second week how to give further guidance and to improve the modalities and to really have a good outcome next year in Belém with respect to transboundary climate risk. We can have, of course, the challenge of not ballooning, and we talk a lot about this before, because we have a lot of transboundary and cross-cutting considerations. We have the 11 targets. So how we can really include in thematic, in dimensional, transboundary climate risks will be very, very important. So we didn't hear from the room many options, not a lot of conversations about targets anyways. We have 9,000 already mapped, but happy to see that some of them are related to transboundary climate risks. So that's one of the main issues, I think, that we really keep very ambitious in terms of maintaining this topic on the agenda to really help the different negotiators to understand why we need. Okay, yeah. Yes. Okay, so maybe I need to do this. Yeah. So to really help the negotiators to understand why it's very important to keep it on the agenda and to give experts more guidance on that. The second one is the relationship with the NCQG, because since the whole relationship between the GGA and the NCQG is very weak right now, one paragraph there and just that. So, of course, transboundary climate risks is even, absent of, or is not there in the equation in a clear and articulated way. So it's also very important, as Katie said, to talk with negotiators and with the different parties to really make them understand why we need more money specifically for this. Same with international organizations and regional organizations, and I'm going to the regional piece. Many times I said this since 2019, that conversations on transboundary climate risk starting to be stronger, that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a lot of good examples to really share with respect to this. In the negative and the positive side on climate transboundary risks, let me just give you a quick sample and just to go. We have a project between Argentina and Uruguay that was and is funded by the Adaptation Fund, occasionally talking about what happened with the fund. This project is quite important. It's a project related to the vulnerability of coastal communities in the Uruguay River. Let me tell you that the context of this, 20 years ago, we had a fight in international court between Argentina and Uruguay because of this river, because of a paper mill installed in this river. So to change that matrix of conflict from that place to the conversation on adaptation and cooperation in adaptation was the very first and very important step. And now, 4 years after all this project really running, we have a lot of very good best practices and good examples in terms of how these coastal communities in both countries and how the NAPs of both countries are very different in terms of process and sectors can really evolve together in order to provide information for BTRs and also for next round of NDCs with respect to these not only vulnerabilities, but also solutions. So, yeah, I wanted to share that. Thank you, and very happy to engage afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pilar, for both bringing us into the negotiating rooms and the conversations that have been happening here. And I'll note that just a few days ago, we had a party object to the language on transboundary. in the GGA negotiations and actually asked for that to be removed. So we'll see if that happens, but that clearly shows more work to be done in the negotiating rooms, but also taking us to Latin America and this great example along the Uruguay River where the conflict, I remember it was in the news on a daily basis. I mean, this was a very big conflict. And to understand how transboundary cooperation and adaptation has really turned it around is a magnificent case study. Next, we'll go to Mr. Argo Singha Roy, who's the Director of Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the Asian Development Bank. Argo is going to talk to us a little bit about how to better leverage the mandates and capabilities of multinational development banks, such as ADB, to strengthen work and cooperation on adaptation and transboundary climate risks. And again, I'll note, I said this the other day when we were speaking, MDBs have a lot of challenges that restrict them and often a lack of flexibility. But I think the ADB has really been innovating to tackle a lot of the forefront issues on adaptation. So would love to hear how you're doing that.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, colleagues, for having us. Always appreciate the work of Adaptation Without Borders. Great to learn from you guys. Maybe I'm going to turn the question a bit, say, other way around. I heard a lot of colleagues talking about finance not flowing for this, kind of issues. I mean, is the finance not flowing because we are talking? Sorry, yeah. All right. Can you hear me? Thank you. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. So is the finance not flowing because we are emphasizing the risk more? Will finance flow better if we talk about the opportunities that this will provide? I think this is important to understand because I was looking at, we at ADB been working on regional cooperation largely for the last 40 years. And the kind of language they use is, I took a note of it, cross-border infrastructure, everybody invest in, trade integration, financial sector integration, because you want finance to flow, regional integration of markets. This is the kind of language people investing in regional cooperation typically use. And if you unpack that language, it's all about opportunities. So if you do this at a regional level, then that becomes an opportunity for further investments to come in and the region develop as a system, as a whole. So maybe one thing is to maybe see how we can change the narrative from risk to the opportunities that these investments will bring in. The second is that beyond the climate funds, and I'm slightly deviating from your question before I go to ADB, beyond the climate funds, if you want to mobilize larger financing for regional, let's say, issues around transboundary risks and opportunities, then we have to look at non-traditional partners. So one of the partners is the banking sector. If you look at any region, I can take the ASEAN region, Southeast Asia region as an example, there are many banks that not only function in their country, but in other countries because they want to penetrate the markets. Now, each of these banks will face a risk from physical climate risk because of operations in each country. So maybe one way of looking is how can we move beyond the traditional stakeholders who we think about providing money for adaptation and think about other stakeholders who have vested interest in the region because they want to grow their market and have more development. So that's the second bit of it. And the third bit of it from ADB point of view, so what we have been doing last couple of years is regional cooperation has always been one of the priorities for ADB, always. But within the regional cooperation, we have now emphasized climate mitigation, adaptation, regional public good as a strong part of that RCI, of portfolio of ours. And to incentivize that, we have created, as a part of our, World Bank as IDA, we have got Asian Development Fund as a counterpart funding, basically, for most vulnerable country. We have created a new window that provide additional grant-only financing for investments that are looking at regional cooperation and adaptation as a solution. And secondly, just a couple of days back over here, we announced a very big program for Central Asia, from glaciers to farm. The whole idea is to bring in investments that are looking at regional issues from glaciers melt to farms. So this is, I think, a positive sign. So we are taking small steps, but I must highlight the issues. Even if you create the incentive mechanism for these kind of investments, at the end of the day, decisions for investments happen at a country level. How a country wants to use its own financing, it's a country is the one. So I think much more convening has to happen to bring countries together to understand and make them understand the issues, but also the opportunities. If they invest in these issues, what they benefit from, perhaps that's the way we can shift the narrative and have essentially more finance flow through it. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Argo, for really thought-provoking comments there. And I'm going to kind of use this as a basis for discussion a little bit more. And I saw you nodding your head a lot when Argo was talking about this issue of opportunity and reframing and how do we actually harness some of the vested interests. And just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that and see, do you see opportunities to do that in this region? To reframe the narrative, to use the vested interests to get more powerful actors engaged and working together on this issue.
Thank you very much. It's been really enlightening to listen to all of you. And I think the governments here are realizing in this part of the world where I am. Now, Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, for example, have a joint fund of $500 million, where the entities in Azerbaijan will invest in Uzbekistan and then in here. I think for the private sector, speaking as a private sector, I'm not government, the best thing to do is to invest in the other countries and ask them to invest in your country. When there is this cross-country investment platform, then you can look the issue on a high level. The same thing is for multinational companies, the great seed companies like Monsanto, BASF. They also should look at this whole region, as a totality. So this is really what I wanted to share. For example, in the ports in Azerbaijan, we now have a lot of Kazakh investors which want to invest in our ports, and we have the same issues: lack of water, the port infrastructure, the challenges we have. You see, it doesn't matter if you invest $2 billion, modernize your port to be resilient to the next 20 years of water levels in the Caspian, if the other port is not ready. Whatever you have done here, it's a loss of money. You have to make sure the other side is mirroring your investment. We really are living in a world, especially, I think ecology, we should really approach it in a very religious sense. Religious in the original Latin sense of religare, bring us all together. We really have to see that this cannot be handled locally. The investors also should have this mindset. Thank you.
Fantastic points. Katie and Pilar, this next one is for both of you. It's an issue that's a perennial issue with transboundary risks, is that there's no clear risk owner. There's no one whose mandate it is to manage transboundary risks, because it cuts across sectors and ministerial lines and boundaries, as it were. And so would love to hear your thoughts, and particularly any examples you can bring where we've been able to get that risk ownership clarified, where we've been able to bring in some of the unusual suspects, so often climate risks that put to climate ministries, but actually we need to be talking to finance ministries, trade ministries, far beyond just the environment and climate ministries to handle these risks. And again, we just heard about private sector involvement as well. Any good examples on how we've been able to assign those risks or create management, to create mandate for risk management?
Whew, that's a big question. Couple of things spring to mind. So First of all, to pick up on your point on public-private collaboration, it is absolutely critical that businesses, the private sector, step up and help the supply chains that they manage to adapt to the impacts of climate change right across their value chains. And this is in businesses' own interests. It's also in the community's interests that are reliant on those supply chains. But it's all well and good to say, okay, well, this is all for businesses to do. Businesses need an enabling environment from governments. They need the right incentives. They need governments to level the playing field, and they face a number of barriers when it comes to adaptation themselves of their supply chains. So we've been exploring this with a number of businesses over the last couple of years. We've been working with the World Economic Forum, who have started a new initiative to really support and enable and encourage businesses to take stronger action to adapt to the effects of climate change in their supply chains. We've been working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, with UN Global Compact, and with Business for Social Responsibility to really try to define this, like who needs to manage what risk, and what risks is the private sector best placed to manage, and what risks governments and the public sector best placed to manage. I don't think we're at the stage yet where we have answers, but it's really encouraging to see the level of engagement and interest from the private sector, who I think have really woken up as well, both governments and the private sector alike, since COVID, to understand really how these, what starts off as a threat or as a risk over there, can very quickly cascade across countries, continents, but also from one sector to another, and that we have to manage this more proactively and more comprehensively. Another area I would say is we are starting to see some countries really take a different approach to their climate risk and vulnerability assessments that then inform their national adaptation planning, and really try to integrate transboundary climate risks into their national adaptation plans, and through that process try to assign risk owners for different risks. Several countries are starting to do this. The UK, I would say, is a front runner in that for their third climate risk and vulnerability assessment and their national adaptation plan, they identified, I think it's something like 61 risks, and a high number of those were transboundary climate risks. And for each risk, they have assigned a risk owner across their different departments and ministries, whose job it is not to try and manage that risk alone, but to engage all the relevant ministries in devising an action plan to manage that risk. I'd love to go back in a year's time and ask them how they've done it, how well they think they've achieved that, and some of the opportunities but also challenges they face. But it does show that this is possible, and I think my concern is at the moment is, while we are starting to see some countries integrate transboundary risks into their NAPs, into their national adaptation plans, it is those countries with the capacities and the resources to do so. And my fear is that we will see widening inequities around the world, that it will be those countries with fewer resources, with fewer coping capacities when it comes to climate change, that will struggle to devote the resources to do this kind of work, and that we will get that even bigger divide between countries who are able to adapt to these risks and those who aren't.
Thank you for the question. I was thinking of like one more positive, one more or not so positive, just to compare in the same region, in my region. For many time, water management was, something a little bit contentious in Cuenca del Plata and in South America. So we have some cooperation agreements and institutions to really help us to deal with that, and that have been for some decades to help us. But at the same time, when you analyze those institutions, climate mainstreaming is not so strong. So of course, transboundary climate risk is still not there. So I think that is a case where you see all what happened in Brazil this year, what happened in Uruguay and Argentina in the first part of the year and last year. I mean, I don't know if you know that people from Uruguay stay for a month drinking salty water. I mean, this is completely out of any equation in the history of our sub-region and in a region blessed by water. So this was very strong in the identity and the logic of the sub-region, but then the response in terms of dealing with that at the planning level, at the cooperation level and transboundary climate risk was not so strong. So I think that's a but we have a potential there. So that's the other side. Then when you go to agriculture, where the private sector is very strong, and the relationship between the same countries, I mean, referring to the same countries, they have dealt with risk forever in agriculture. So now they are already pretty advanced in terms of the ownership of risks. Of course, when you lose a big percentage of your GDP because of the droughts or floods refer to climate change in countries that are based on agriculture. I mean, agriculture is main for our economies. So it's logic that you consider. I mean, that you have more cooperation and more ownership. But then water is also a big part of that equation that didn't. So I think that are the kind of inconsistencies. I think private sector played a very good role on that regard in order to help that conversation, to help also public sector, not only at the traditional level of institutions that are very important, but also to understand which are the tools that you can develop to deal with transboundary risk at the agriculture level. Then the out is water. I don't know if I was clear enough. I think it's difficult to provide that picture. But trying to have these two sides of the same page, because finally water and agriculture, in particular for very small businesses, small farmers, are even more important. I don't know if...
I'll pass it over to you or go next in a second. We'll open up for questions in a minute if there are questions from the audience, but also invite panelists to ask each other questions or respond to each other's comments. Orgo, just a quick question from you. So we heard from Jessica at the beginning with the example from Lake Victoria that really went from community-based or locally led adaptation to the transboundary regional level, and I know that both of these are areas where the ADB is working and doing some pioneering work. Would love to see how you see the connectivity from the locally led up to the transboundary level, and how that may be happening if you have examples to draw from, or if not, what are some of the challenges that need to be addressed?
Sure. Okay, couple of examples come to mind. There's some work happening in the Greater Mekong region, some cross-border towns between Laos and Vietnam, or Laos and Cambodia, and we are investing in these cross-border towns primarily from infrastructure point of view. But we have figured out that a lot of people, they cross border for daily work and come back, kind of thing, right? So it's an important thing to keep in mind, because if you're investing in one of the towns and the infrastructure in the other one is not sufficiently good enough, then during flooding or drought, it affects. So I think that's a kind of an, from a mobility point of view, it's important to understand. Now, the work on flood risk management that connects, countries, there a lot of work happens at a community level of communities in adjacent countries living together, whatever, similar kind of approaches. But beyond that, I am not aware of so much work that's connected from local to that regional scale. But saying that, I'm sure there are opportunities there. Again, for me, the issue is that at the end of the day, much of this investments in transboundary depends on how much a region or a sub-region wants to identify themselves as one. So Southeast Asia, ASEAN has a very strong, identity of ASEAN, one ASEAN. The region I come from, not so much. But so there are, I think geopolitically, we're talking, I think that's very important. And where you have those kind of strong identity, I think one should take advantage of this, because there the commitments are going to be much, much higher to look at these issues together. Where there are not so much, then it becomes slightly difficult. Maybe that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're trying to promote this work. Sorry, I didn't ask a question directly, actually.
No, but a really good observation and a really good provocation again from you. Let's go to the audience, but also if there are any questions that you want to ask each other, let me know. Any questions from the audience? Okay, we'll take a couple questions and then come back.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Céline Kaufmann. I'm part of IDDRI, which is one of the partners within OBI. Thank you to all the speakers. That was fascinating and super interesting. I have actually two related questions. The first one has to do with the institutional setup to make it happen, to make happen the transboundary cooperation that was alluded for the case of Latin America, for example, because it's very difficult to sustain cooperation, across borders on a project-by-project approach. So if you need an institution, to kind of support that, we know that the water sector is an example, a sector where there are many areas in the world that already have institutions that support cooperation, but the issue is probably that they don't have the mandate to look at climate adaptation. Do we have good example to showcase where you may know of one institution that is doing the job actually well of integrating the adaptation and the climate risk into a broader mandate? That would be the first question. And it leads me to the second one, which is very related to what you were mentioning from the ADB perspective, because regional development banks, they are regional institutions in a way, channeling a specific, object, which is finance. But you have, multiple members, you can support cooperation. And you mentioned actually what you're doing in terms of providing seed funding, more or less, for this new infrastructure. But I have the feeling that the big issue is not the new funding for new infrastructure, is actually changing the mindset and the mandate of the investment that goes into the traditional infrastructure that might not be resilient. So how do you make that shift so that, the traditional finance that goes into infrastructure, more generally speaking, actually shift to resilient infrastructure and not to the traditional infrastructure that will lock in countries into non-resilient infrastructure?
Great. So a question on institutions and then mainstreaming this into the large-scale finance around infrastructure.
Thank you. Richard Klein, Stockholm Environment Institute, and also one of the founding organizations behind Adaptation Without Borders. My question is specifically about the issue of knowledge sharing and international cooperation, which last year countries agreed is needed to be able to manage transboundary climate risk. My question to the panel would be, what platform or what opportunities do you see where that knowledge sharing and international cooperation could take place sort of on a continuous basis? The UNFCCC, of course, has opportunities. There's the Nairobi Work Program for knowledge and information sharing. One could think of some kind of dialogue to discuss international cooperation, but of course that's only the beginning. Where, particularly outside of the UNFCCC process, would this international cooperation and knowledge sharing take place?
Great. Question around knowledge sharing and where it can take place. And one last question here.
Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm Beatrice Masello from Senior Advisor on Climate, Peace and Security at Adelphi. We are currently working on a project with the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, in Central Asia and other regions, using exactly the same approach, kind of cooperation over shared climate risks, to kind of improve also the relationships between countries, countries, between different actors at the regional level. Our project starts from the local level. So we work in municipalities across the border to tackle, for example, fire-related risks or risks coming from glacier melting and so on. And then we kind of use that as an entry point to build cooperation between countries and kind of improve the regional landscape. I was wondering, from your presentation, so from, for example, a Regional Development Bank perspective, how do you go the other way? So how do you make sure that the kind of regional approach gets down and provides benefit to the very local level, so to the communities, to the cities, to the villages, so that at the end of the day, they are the one kind of benefiting from better management of these joint risks. Thank you so much.
Super, thank you. Some excellent questions. Who wants to start?
I'm a businessman. I have no idea how to answer your questions. But I want to say something as a citizen of the world and citizen of this region. This situation in Central Asia is horrendous. Our governments should understand one thing. If we don't talk, there will be wars. You see, you have to understand, when your food depends on water, that's critical. But think of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. 95% of their energy, electricity, depends on water as well. And water is evaporating. So if your energy and your food depends on this, and you're an upstream country, and you're trying to hold on to that water, and downstream, there is this great Fergana Valley, 20 million people survive on this water. And I encourage you to see these rivers, the Amu River, and the Sir River that flows from these mountains, glaciers. Let me picture this. The whole desert, thousands of kilometers, almost as dry as a granite. And then you have this snake of green, just goes on for 1,000 kilometers, just a few kilometers wide in this dark desert. And this is where 20 million people survive. And the water is evaporating. So this is, look at our region. I pray every day that Azerbaijan and Armenia come to a peace agreement ASAP, because the rivers that are flowing from Turkey to this part of the world are also drying up, the Aras Kura River. I honestly think it is the ecology that brings the necessity of us working together. We can't afford wars anymore, simply because of the dangers, existential danger that we are in. Thank you very much.
Wow, follow that. I'm going to try and attempt Richard's question, which is around ongoing cooperation, but I might also turn to a few others in the audience who I know have as much experience on this topic, if not more so than me. So if we've got time, we'll see, but I also welcome comments and those of you in the audience also sharing your experiences and as well as your questions. But yeah, ongoing cooperation, I think there is a lot more regional organisations could be doing than they're doing at the moment to actually implement and coordinate adaptation to transboundary climate risks that their member states face. We've been working on a big project, Cascades, over the last 4 years that looked at what more the EU and its member states could be doing to strengthen cooperation to manage these risks on a more regular basis. And the lead author of the summary report is in the audience, so talk to Ruth afterwards if you'd like to know more. We've also been working with the Nordic Council of Ministers, for instance, on what role they could play to be supporting their member states in adaptation. So I think regional organisations can do a lot, particularly for the risks that their regions have in common, that their member states have in common. But then there are other transboundary climate risks that are truly international, that really do connect countries thousands of miles apart. Those the ones that we've talked about to do with trade, to do with finance. I don't think it's possible for us to advance adaptation to those sorts of risks through regional cooperation alone. And there I think we really do need some of the international organisations to be playing a much stronger role on adaptation. You can imagine sort of WFP, for instance, playing a much stronger role in the transboundary climate risks to food security around the world. The locally led adaptation agenda is so important. We know adaptation has to be context specific. We know it works best when local communities are empowered and driving the adaptation solutions that they need. But this is why it's so important to sort of get information from the global to the local level and right back up again, so that local communities understand the transboundary climate risks they face. They understand what adaptation solutions they can implement. In the case of food security, maybe it's local food banks and so on. But that adaptation also happens at the higher scales as well. And we need to really treat adaptation as the global challenge that the Paris Agreement professes it to be.
Thank you for the questions. I will try to address these two, or at least make some comments. I will start with yours because it's quite related to the example I provided, and I think it's very interesting to understand what the institutions that we already have can really what we can achieve there and what we cannot achieve there and what we need to do. As you said, I can't agree more. In the case of the Uruguay River, for example, just to maintain the example, let's say, we have a commission. That commission was formed in the 60s, 70s, in a very conflict context between South American countries for water. At that point in time, in particular for energy coming from water. So at that point in time, all these institutions came in order to manage common resources, such as CARU, this one. And the idea there was just to say what you can do and what you cannot do in a common resource, and the previous exchange that parties need to do before doing whatever. So it's just that. So any attempt to really mainstreaming more, even though there are a lot of, different exchanges between in this case, the two countries, then what can really CARU do more with respect to this? You need a complete transformation. You need to change the letter and the constitution of the body itself to really mainstreaming. Do you have the vocation to do that? Well, of course, currently in Argentina, you don't have it at all, but previously, we were not there, even with other contexts. So I agree that probably we will need to check institution by institution in order to see which institution can really be amended in a way that really mainstream transboundary climate risks, and the ones that will not be able or is even more messy, and you need to develop something that can be bigger. That I think it's very important and positive in the context of South American cooperation, for example, that we have a lot of common rivers and common and shared basins. So that's not something so atypical. Because then if you need to change the purpose of every single document, that could be more difficult. Same with the NAPs, because right now even the countries have different type of NAPs. So you see that Uruguay, for example, Uruguay has sectoral NAPs. So they have a coastal NAP. So they could incorporate, and they incorporate the two sides. I mean, they provided their risks associated with the river, and also incorporate what is coming for the project. And Argentina is more in terms of ecoregions. So I think that's a good example, because you have two different stories there in terms of how you develop your planning instruments, but in both cases they could include it and also come back with solutions that are common solutions. Right now you have climate considerations, transboundary climate risk in both NAPs with respect to the same river in a different language, or considering the two different NAPs or methodologies of both. My last, with respect to Richard's comment, I was thinking of the same with respect to all the conversation on para 38. I think that that's a very interesting entry point, because even if, I mean, sorry? Yeah, I will. I'm going there. Thank you, Christina, for giving me that heads up. It's true. During this week, a lot of conversations in the Global Goal on Adaptation room, let's say, of the negotiations. The G77 expressed that they wanted to discuss at the same level that the World Programme on Indicators, the paragraph 38 of the decision of last year. That paragraph includes different provisions. One of them, I think it was the first one, but I can be confused, is about knowledge sharing. So another one on IPCC, another one of risk, other one of review of the framework, etc. So and since the whole decision already said that organizations, international organizations, as you said, can really step up to say, okay, I'm not the owner of this indicator, but I can really be part of the global effort and really step up to say, I think Adaptation Without Borders can really, and many different organizations can really step up to say, for a lot of years, we have been monitoring transboundary climate risks. If we have an indicator, and a specific indicator for thematic, for the cycle, for both of it, it's really interesting if you can develop some kind of platform that can really have all this information together. So I see that's a very interesting landing point.
Maybe I'm going to just briefly answer your question on the infrastructure. I don't think the approach of mainstreaming climate risk management in infrastructure or climate proofing of infrastructure works anymore. The risk regime has completely changed. So what we need to do is understand the risk context, current and future risk, and then decide in that risk context what infrastructure is most appropriate, which is very different from mainstreaming traditional approach. But of course, that decision depends on what is your purpose. Is your purpose to provide basic services to the poorest population? Is your purpose to do trade connectivity? Is your purpose to do something else? Depending on that purpose and the understanding of the risk landscape, then you decide what is the most appropriate infrastructure. For connectivity, if that's your purpose, maybe the infrastructure is a road, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually waterways is the most effective way of connecting in the future. So I think this change of mindset, of understanding risk, the landscape, current and future very well, with the uncertainties associated with, of course, and in that context decide what kind of investment is most appropriate is the change we need. Currently what happens is there is an investment on road. It's decided already, road will be built. Okay, now let me look at the flood risk the road might face. Let's change the design of the road structure. But that is not going to take you anymore because the risk regime has changed so much and continuously changing. So that's kind of a patchwork, kind of solution. So I think this big shift is required. That makes sense, I don't know.
Super. Does anyone want to take the question on making sure that local communities benefit? Anyone? Yeah.
I can give an example as a businessman. We are one of the largest distributors of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, seeds in this business in Azerbaijan. And the multinationals which work with us in here were so pleased with our efforts. They asked us to be active in Uzbekistan as well. Once we went into that country, we realized the low level of education of the farmers in local there about how to choose the right seeds, how to apply pesticides at the right. It really was a stark contrast to Azerbaijan, which is a little bit better. But after we work with them for a while, because we're selling seeds or whatever, all these products, we want our money back from the people we've sold. And if that person is not making money, we can't make money. And we realized that the current seeds that are available in the world, in fact, it's not suitable for the climate. So we started a seed breeding program right there in Uzbekistan. This is a lot of investment and effort because we went there with a long-term view and in close touch with the farmers, trying to bring a whole new variety of seed that is adaptable to that location. And only later on I realized what a valuable input this is to the local economy, as I spoke to some African countries and there was a lot of demand, say, Tahir, please come to our part of the world as well. So yes, as a businessman, large companies which can drive top-down change are important to me. The visions are important. I have one last comment. Madam, I love your French accent in English. Reminds me of my partner who is also French, and I adore her, and I love you. Je vous aime, vous êtes magnifique.
That's a lovely note to end this panel on. Thank you so much to our panelists for really thought-provoking ideas, reframings, examples, examples from all different regions and walks of life. So thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for our panel here. I'll invite you to take a seat, and then to close us up, I'd like to invite Mr. Ayman Cherakouri. Did I say that right? There we go. He's the director at the Hassan II International Center for Environmental Training and coordinator of the Mohammed VI Prize for Climate and Sustainable Development, and also an Adaptation Without Borders ambassador. So happy to have you here. I will turn. Are you speaking first, Katie? No. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Love is a tough act to follow, but I'm certainly loving the being part of this important activity. So to provide some elements of reflections in terms of a potential path forward, I'm gonna, as I often do, take inspiration from my dear friend Richard and his question earlier about within the nurture-proceed process, but also outside of nurture-proceed process. And let me take this up. So in terms of that, within nurture-proceed process, of course, the UAE Global Climate Resilience Framework provided, I think, very important opportunities in terms of engagement to further drive forward the agenda that we are all working on. And specifically, of course, when you look, and it's not the only example, well, I think it's Article 50 or 60, around there, 60 and 61, where you have the 7 thematic targets, and then you have the 4 process targets that are right after that. And the chapeau of the article about the 7 thematic targets clearly indicate action at all levels. So national, regional, local, global, etc. So I think that provides us with a bit of a not quite Trojan horse, but a bridge for us to engage in that important opportunity to contribute to the substance of the process going forward. The other opportunity, one of the other opportunity as I can think of, connected to nurture-proceed process, but not quite within, in the IPCC process, as part of the 7th assessment cycle, we have a special report that will be on cities and climate change. And transboundary collaboration between cities, I think, is a space that is quite transformational and perhaps that we have yet to fully capture in terms of cascading climate risks and beyond. Of course, as I saw the UNEP logo, next year there will be the 7th United Nations Environment Assembly, the theme of which is still being refined and defined, and to be decided in the month of December. But again, there is an interesting space for us to further engage, mainstream, and contribute to progress in terms of that important agenda. And also, I had another one I thought of as I was sitting down and being very inspired by the remarks, but it is eluding me right now, I have to say. Hopefully it'll come back within the next couple of minutes. In the meantime, I wanted to share with you a quote from Barack Obama. It's not the most recent quote, but he said once that we are not defined by our borders, but by our bonds. And this idea of bonds, I think, is very critical to the way Adaptation Without Borders work, in terms of bonds being sometimes a source of vulnerability when you look at transboundary climate risks, but also bonds being a source of power and strength and scale and speed when it comes to defining solutions, better developing knowledge and understanding as for what are those climate risks. And there's amazing work that's been done by the Adaptation Without Borders, all the different partners, of course, but as a conglomerate. And how we can further build on that work and identify solutions as a continuation of that knowledge work, I think would be an amazing contribution that the Adaptation Without Borders is already making, but that we're committed to making even more. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We could give a little round of applause for that. Thanks so much, Ayman. I have the unenviable task of trying to synthesize such a rich discussion over the last 90 minutes. I'm going to take my headphones off as well. I would say, thank you. I would say we started off an hour and a half ago with Jessica from UNEP reminding us that transboundary climate risks are already manifesting. We heard about two very specific examples in the Lake Victoria Basin, also in South Sudan. But we also heard how UNEP are advancing programs to manage these transboundary climate risks. And I think this really shows it can be done. When we first started Adaptation Without Borders in 2019, we were repeatedly told it's too complex, they're too abstract. These risks are really of a level above our ability to manage. And I think this work, these programs, fly in the face of that and are a real testament to what can be scaled up and achieved in the future. Then we had a fantastic panel discussion. We really heard from Tahir about how much businesses in the private sector and this region, where we're gathered here today at COP29, is really facing transboundary climate risks, really at the forefront, the front end of them, but also how much we need international collaboration, regional collaboration, private-public collaboration to manage them. We need to talk about these risks, however political, however challenging, however complex, we need to be talking about them. We heard from Pilar about, well, first of all, a great example that gave us hope and optimism from the Latin America region about how we can advance progress and adaptation and cooperation to manage these risks, but about also how much work we have to do to find their place, find how they fit within the UNFCCC negotiations, particularly as we think about developing indicators over the next 2 years towards the global goal on adaptation. How do we account for transboundary climate risks there in ways that aren't overwhelming and overburdening to parties and adding to the proliferation of indicators, but still manage to reflect them? And then we heard from Ogoye at the Asian Development Bank around how we need to really think about change in mindset to do with risk, but also a change in narrative, that we can't just focus on the risks, we also need to focus on the opportunities that investments to managing these risks could afford. We need to think about new actors, the role that banks could play in managing these risks. And we've heard of the opportunities that lie ahead over the next year. So I just want to thank everyone. I also want to thank Christina for doing a fantastic job moderating this. And we're really appreciative to our friends at the UN Foundation for advancing this journey with us here. And to encourage all of you to get involved in Adaptation Without Borders. We've got this fantastic pavilion here hosted by ODI. Over the next week, we have a number of events coming up on transboundary climate risks. Tomorrow, looking at doing a deep dive on Africa, doing another deep dive in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. We have 13 partners around the world, but that number is growing all the time. We aim to have 3 pillars to our work, so not only to build the research and evidence base on these risks, but also to engage policymakers in these risks and have conversations with funders and those implementing adaptation programs to build resilience to these risks in practice. So we need all of you. Oh, you remember? Okay. We need all of you with us on the journey, but we've done a huge amount to raise awareness of these risks, to build a platform for these risks with the support of many in this room here today, but the time has come, the time is overdue for solutions and resilience building to these risks. So I'm going to hand over to Ayman for the final word, because he always gives a good final word.
No.
I think it's on now.
It's working? Okay. 1, 2, 3. So? Okay. So yeah, there were 2 points I wanted to briefly make. Apologies for, but I just remembered them. The first of which is to signal within the context of regional collaboration the very important work that the Adaptation Without Borders did in Africa, including when it comes to AMSEN and closely working in that space, for example, in Dakar, and since to make sure that not only are we pushing this agenda forward, but we're also providing solutions to the issues that we identify. I think that was a point I wanted to make. And the second, in terms of opportunities next year, the IUCN World Conservation Congress is also happening. It doesn't happen that often, only once every 4 years, and it could be an interesting space as well to see how we can further drive this forward. Thank you, and apologies for coming back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I also love your accent. So just to continue with the theme. I want to thank our panelists, want to thank everyone for joining us here today, for those joining online as well. It's been a fantastic dialogue. And I'm not a great moderator. I didn't do the one thing that every moderator should do, which is at the beginning, recognize the organizations that were involved in organizing today. So I do want to acknowledge that this was organized and all the hard work done by the Stockholm Environment Institute, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, IDDRI, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Overseas Development Institute in organizing today's session. Thank you for being here with us. And we wish you good luck with the rest of your day, and please do leave your headsets on the chair. Thanks.